Well, good morning. Nice to meet you again, Amanda. The Ram Chargers were a group of newly minted young Chrysler engineers uh, who met at the Chrysler Institute, which was a highly selective program in the back in the day. And this was a period of time in the late 50s through uh, the, the late 60s and early 70s. But most of the real activity where they came together was in the late 50s and early 60s. And they found that within that population of students, there was a few fellow sort of car nuts and enthusiasts for improving the performance of cars. And drag racing at that point was a really growing and hot sport. You know, there was a lot. This was, of course, taking place in Detroit, and there was a lot of stoplight comparisons, that sort of thing going on. And the guys were pretty acutely aware that the Chrysler cars weren't looking real good compared to the Ford and General Motors products of the day. And so they were attempting to experiment with their own cars. They had some money for the first time in their lives to see what they could do to improve performance. They also founded the Chrysler cutting room floors of within engineering. Lots of good concepts that hadn't really been fully pursued in some of these sorts of venues. So they came together. They decided to build a team car, which they raced for about a year, that was highly experimental and quite successful, called the High and Mighty. And then along the way, over the years, and I'm going to kind of speak of this, as you say, in a nutshell, we're able to draw the interest of Dodge and a very visionary public relations director by the name of Frank Wiley at Dodge, who was willing to come on and offer them the use of Dodge vehicles over the succession of years. And they are able to be very, very successful with them. They were the only group of automotive engineers from any of the manufacturers that actually was able to race successfully on their own. They set many national records, won many national championships. And in addition to that, and the straight up racing activities that they're involved with, they, of course, were still engineers at Chrysler. And so they were turned to, during the 60s, which was a period of a lot of interest in motorsports, to help create a nucleus of engineers to form what they would call the race group within Chrysler. From that group, any number of things flowed, but they were responsible for doing that and also enhancing the performance of other aspects of product lines, Plymouth cars, Dodge cars, and so on. And in addition, Chryslers, in addition to just the Dodges. And to conclude, they were probably especially well known for being able to accomplish more with less assets than many of their contemporaries at the time.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so can you tell us how your initial introduction to the Ram Chargers came about and what led you to your involvement within the group?
Oh, well, I was the baby of the group. These fellows were already working at Chrysler. I was a 15-year-old kid at that time in the 9th grade. But I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan. My father was an automotive engineer. A lot of my friends' dads were automotive engineers in that community. There was no small amount of rivalry, smack talk, that sort of thing going on. And I was pretty aware that the Chevys and the Pontiacs and the Fords were out ahead of the Chrysler cars. And so I was really interested in seeing some ray of hope there for some pride. At that point, my dad was at Chrysler. And there was a match race in April of 1962 at Detroit Dragway between Dino Don Nicholson, who had the current reigning national championship 409 Chevy in super stock, and this new group of engineers called the Ram Chargers, who had a 62 Dodge, that there was a growing kind of awareness of, but not much real knowledge of. So anyway, I went to the race. And the Ram Chargers comported themselves quite nicely and gave the Chevy a good battle. Didn't win the race due to some mechanical difficulties, I'd say, but I'd found her heroes. And from that point on, I was just enthralled with the idea of this group, and they became my heroes. And whenever they were racing in the area, I was always be sure to be there and buy a pit pass, be there early, and hang around them. If somebody dropped a wrench, I'd pick it up. If somebody needed a Coke, I'd run for it. And over time, they learned who I was. I learned their names. Actually, I'd known any number of their names and so forth from pictures and magazines that I recognized. But this continued to progress, and I got more nerve and asked if I could go on a road trip with them sometime, and they agreed. And that sort of continued to progress the connection and relationship. And along the way, they learned to trust me more and offer me more responsibilities. I learned to drive and could go over to their facility where they worked on the cars. And I just became increasingly involved with them until actually I became a pretty functioning member of the group, the team. And it's something I must say to this day. I have the deepest feelings of gratitude to those wonderful guys who would give a kid like that a chance out of the blue. And they were my heroes then, and they still are my heroes today. They're not as many of them as they used to be, but it's been a real blessing in my life.
That's absolutely wonderful. So over the years, you've maintained a close-knit bond with the Ram Chargers. Can you share the moment when you decided to transform their story into a book and what inspired that decision?
Well, as so many things in life, it's when things go wrong, you figure out how to do them right. I guess. No, we were in 1997, we were being inducted into the Michigan Motorsports Hall of Fame. And the man who was introducing us and gave our bios left some pretty big holes in it. And primarily, he was not bad on catching a lot of the records and racing accomplishments, that sort of thing, but really felt that he had missed the larger body of work that the group had been involved in creating. And one of the guys, Danny Mancini, said after it, he said, you know, this is getting lost. Nobody's going to ever remember what happened here and what how things got to here now from there. We're like the missing link, and it's just being lost. Somebody ought to write a book. And so on the way driving home, I was chatting with my wife Mary about it, and she said, you know, you can write pretty well. Maybe you should write the book. And 10 years later, I think she wished she would have just turned off the radio, but we didn't. And really, from there, we had the good fortune of one of the engineers in the group was I think on the board at SAE, and he got to know some of the folks there and mentioned that we were considering a book, and so SAE contacted me. And one thing led to another, and they became a wonderful partner with us in creating these books. And they speak for themselves. They turned out to be a tremendous success, and I think it has a lot to do with the wonderful people at SAE. Martha Swiss, who was with us earlier, and now Amanda at Sherry, and so on.
That's fantastic. And, as you mentioned, with so many of the Ram Chargers not being with us today, it's such a wonderful way to capture their story and keep it alive. Mm-hmm. So the book is a combination of personal stories, historical accounts, and technical details. How did you balance these different elements to create such a cohesive narrative that appeals to both racing enthusiasts and general readers?
Well, this question fits perfectly in some ways. with one of the points I just touched on, and that had to do with the body of work. Those elements, like the people and the technology and the history, that was sort of what Danny Mancini was talking about, was getting lost. So integrating these things in some ways was not difficult at all. Actually, they were highly complementary. And the sort of the people part, the young engineers and the Ram Chargers, they all had their stories. They all were ambitious guys had come to Chrysler with dreams of being involved in all kinds of exotic motorsports and found none. But so they really wanted to see something, more activity in that area. They also wanted to prove themselves. They wanted to be able to go out there and think, after all the years of school and that sort of thing. We're hoping they could do that. And this I think seemed like an opportunity to them, which of course it was just an incredible opportunity. And so their engagement and involvement was a story in and of itself. Then in the technology, of course, during the period of the Ram Chargers, in which they became increasingly involved at their day jobs as well as their after-hour jobs with the group, which I might add too, was always an after-hours, unpaid group, so that it was freestanding from Chrysler, and this was something they were doing on their own, and it did have involvement through some help from Chrysler with parts and that sort of thing from Dodge, but it really was something that on their own initiative they created and continued to pursue. So that the technology piece that came along with it, of course, was things like the Slant 6 motor and the Hyper Pack, which was very successful in competing within the compact car market. What came to be known as the Max Wedge motors, which were the cross ram 420, 413, 426 motors, became very successful in drag racing. They had the first of those. They were intimately involved in the development of the Hemi and 426 Hemi engine when Chrysler decided they wanted to go to Daytona and win. And of course, that translated also into a drag racing version, which they're involved with. There was transmission development, high stall speed torque converters. There were chassis developments and the evolution of the configurations of the stock car bodies and the birth of the funny car, which they were involved with, and also even in dragster development, the first Chrysler motors on nitro and supercharged and top fuel drag racing, all of that they were at the forefront of. And there was the whole story of that interaction between the individuals and their day jobs and then the evening jobs, their evening group team with the Ram Chargers. And then there was a historical impact all of this, not just in terms of the record books and accomplishments there, but also the impact on the evolution of Chrysler and Dodge and their product line, which really went from a much more conservative stance to one where it was kind of cool to own a Mopar. Jan and Dean were singing about it, the little old lady from Pasadena, which incidentally was birthed after the Ram Chargers won the Winter Nationals in 1963 in their super stock Dodge. So I mean, there was that whole cultural movement that occurred with it too, that the guys were involved with, and those are all things and threads that we really tried to pull and have come to life in the book.
So during the research and writing process for the book, were there any surprising discoveries or insights that came to light that you hadn't previously considered or known about?
Well, now that's one. Yes, it's interesting. When I was with the group and we were racing, and in the other lane would be one of the Ford factory cars, Mercury factory cars, one of the GM cars. They were always these separate racers. that didn't have the sort of affiliation that the Ram Chargers had with Chrysler, where we were the guys, from Chrysler and day jobs and all that. And these other guys were contract racers, really, for the other factories. And I always wondered, how could it be that this group existed? Because there was nothing parallel in either of the other companies. And in trying to write the book, it was like trying to hang your hat in the air in telling the Ram Charger story, because it didn't make sense that this group could be circling the way it was and not just be another mercenary group like the other companies had. And so we began to do more in-depth research about the history of Chrysler and the evolution of things there, and I discovered that the personalities of Walter P. Chrysler and John and Horace Dodge were great determining factors in this. In fact, they were highly independent, mavericky kind of guys who were giving lots of autonomy and freedom and authority to their lieutenants, encouraged that, and with them passing at fairly young ages, the corporate structures that grew up in Chrysler was one sort of around that type of foundation. And although the corporate structure in ways was similar to those, of course, of Ford or General Motors, there was still this space, if you will, within the culture of Chrysler for something like a public relations man like Frank Wiley at Dodge, who had a lot of clout, to come along and agree to cooperate in-house with a group of engineers and spawn something like the Ram Chargers. Once we kind of began to realize that's who we were and how it was that we came to be, the whole story of the Ram Chargers and trying to figure out how to write the book, which took a long time to kind of sort through all of this, the whole story began to make some real sense, because there were contract racers that Chrysler had. Ram Chargers were not one of those sort of client groups. We were this hybrid sort of group. And it was because of this, the personalities of these men and the character of the company that allowed for this to happen. We always sort of felt that the teams from that were running for General Motors and Ford were really quite envious of how upfront we could be with our activities in this hybrid sort of role. But that was quite a discovery. And if I may, Dodge nabbed onto this with an advertising campaign some of you may actually have seen, connecting the Dodge brothers often in hot rodding around today in the new cars. In fact, it's been said that had the Dodge brothers lived during the period the Ram Chargers were around, they may well have been Ram Chargers.
So the Ram Chargers had a very profound impact, not only within Chrysler, as you've kind of mentioned previously, but also in the racing world, amassing a very dedicated fan base. What, in your opinion, contributed to their success during the time, and how do you see their legacy resonating with fans today across different age groups and racing events?
Whew, that's a lot. I'd say that their impact in some of these ways had to do with their passion and their focus and the way the group functioned within itself. Tom Hoover, who was one of the founders of the Ram Chargers and is generally credited to be the father of the Hemi, or at least the 426 Hemi, was a fan of Dr. Deming, who at the time was talking about horizontal management and production, engineering in getting things done in the auto industry, as opposed to sort of the Harvard approach of the day, which was much more vertical. And Hoover was a big fan of that approach. And it was the approach that the personalities really, I think, of the guys in the group really took to. And it really worked well. Jim Thornton would say, was president of the group, we just worked so well together. And in that model, competency, contribution, personal ownership, collaboration, those kinds of things were vital to how things were supposed to work. And in the Ramchargers, many of the guys came from different labs at the company and had different training backgrounds. So they had sort of some specialties. Ordinarily, when we would be working, guys with their respective sort of specialties would be maybe working more in their area in respect to the car system. But within the Model 2, guys could flow very freely between whatever their activity was to another activity that might need their support or their contribution. There really were no chiefs in the Ramchargers. We did have a president, Jim Thornton, but it wasn't, it didn't seem in that role ordinarily. He was another member of the team. And guys would kind of, depending upon the circumstance, take a leadership position around solving a problem or accomplishing a task, but then fall back in shoulder to shoulder after it was passed. There are those who would say this was really the forerunner at Chrysler of the whole platform team approach, was to come out of the Ramchargers and the race group at Chrysler. A good example of this, the degree to which it's permeated the group, is on the Ramchargers. One of the unique things about them is that they were better known as a team than they were for any other race drivers. It's very unusual. If you try to think of any teams in race motorsports that are better known ordinarily than their drivers, it's hard to do. But on the Ramchargers, there was never a driver's name on the door. Jim Thornton felt strongly about this. It was part of the ethos of the team. And he would say, people come up to him and say, "Oh, isn't it great? You're driving the car. It must be such a thrill. It's such a big deal." And he'd say, "Not really. It's just another job within the group that needs to be done and done well. And if it's done well, then we'll have a better chance to win." And the goal of everybody in the group is just to do their job well, and our chances of winning will be enhanced. Mike Buckle was another driver, was the same kind of thing. Jim would say, when Mike wins driving the car, I get exactly the same thrill out of it as when I'm driving. And when we win, the car does well, we all win and we do well together. And when we lose, everybody loses and we lose together. Dick Maxwell, who was another member of the group, who started the direct connection program at Chrysler and eventually Mopar Performance, said, when he walked through the pits today of a major NHRA event and looks at the different professional operations, he sees an awful lot of how the Ramchargers functioned in those groups today.
Absolutely. And that was one thing that I was very impressed with, just collaborating on the book, reaching out to different individuals for either testimonials or permissions to use their images in the book. Everybody had this sense of community and camaraderie, and everybody was absolutely honored just to be part of your book or in your book in some small way. So the Ramchargers as a whole has definitely made a lasting impression in the racing community. So can you share a memorable or a particular meaningful story from your time with the Ramchargers that maybe didn't make it into the book?
Oh gosh. Yeah, a few of the juicy ones are for sure in the book. One of the things we really wanted to accomplish with the book was to capture some of the drama, excitement, even beauty, if you will, of that period, because it really was fantastic. And I think today it's considered the golden era of drag racing. one memory might be on Wednesday evenings, Detroit Dragway would sometimes have a race. We're nearly there on the weekends, and they one time we were there in a match race, featured one of the featured cars, and about 8 o'clock, ready to push the car out onto the tarmac, and Gil Cohn, who owned Detroit Dragway, would come running over. He came around. This happened more than once, and he'd say, hold the car, we got to get this crowd in there." And you'd look out at the foot of the dragway down there, and you'd see Sibley Road, and the cars would be bumper to bumper to bumper to bumper all the way across Dix Highway. This is in South Detroit. And then you could see out over the horizon where Sibley Highway would go over I-75, and the cars would be lined up over that bridge. And 25 minutes later, Gil come around. "Okay, it's time to go. Let's go." So we pushed the car out on the tarmac behind the starting line, and you'd be standing behind the car, and the national anthem would begin to play. And at night, the lights would be up, and the colors in the car would become so stark. And I just remember standing behind that car with those beautiful candy apple red stripes on it, the light sparkling off of them, and looking out at that vast crowd and down the track, and realize you're representing Dodge, and just feeling chills at the excitement and the beauty in some ways, and the pride of that moment. And then the Big Tiny starter at Detroit would give the signal to start the car, and the car would start and move forward, and the lights would come up, and the crowd would begin to cheer, and it would just be amazing. And the whole evening would go that way. And as I say, that's something we tried to capture in the book, and I think we've done a pretty good job in a number of different situations. So, but I guess you'd have to read the book to get more of it.
I absolutely agree with you. There are times in the book where you do kind of feel like you're almost right there. It's fantastically well written and put together. So we are kind of running almost to the end of time. I'm sure there's so many more things we could discuss. I did have a few more questions for you, but in lieu of the limited amount of time, is there any final thoughts that you wanted to say?
An interesting thing, sort of for people going forward, and thoughts to remember is what really, at the end of the day, made the whole thing happen and tick. And Tom Hoover, who was one of the founding fathers, father of the Hemi, I'd like just to maybe read to you a summation paragraph, sort of, in our book, that it's a quote from Tom, and I think it captures very much for posterity, and also has a lot to do with how the group, I think, would like to be remembered. And Tom says, "There were a few critical things that allowed us to accomplish much more with much less money than our competition. The most critical of which was the fact we loved it. The guys had ownership. They were interested. Everybody gets to make his contribution. In the Second World War, and Tom was a student, the battleship South Dakota was known for this kind of thing. They were a bunch of barbarians, but boy, were they tough. It blurred with the Ram Chargers between their jobs and their mission with the club. It's the Ram Chargers. It's not Jim Thornton's. It's not Jerry Donnelly's. It's not Gary Congdon's. It's the guys. Everybody's got a Ram Charger shirt. Everybody looks the same. It's beautiful. We were the Ram Chargers."